everyone, and welcome to today's MDDI QMED webinar, Design Principles for Surgical Robotics, sponsored by FUTEK and broadcast by Informa. I'm Daphne Allen, editor of MDDI, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to our webinar. I'll be your moderator, and we have just a few announcements before we begin. Our webinar today is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media, and participate in our Q&A session, which will take place at the end of our presentations. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we will be asking you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A box, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Now, on to our presentations today. I'm really pleased to welcome our speakers. We have Tom KraMer, CEO of Kablooe Design, and Ehsan Mokhberi, Director of Business Development for FUTEK. You can learn more about our speakers by visiting the bios widget. Tom, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Daphne, appreciate it. Thank you for attending, everyone. We have a really good turnout and a big crowd here today, so I'm excited to see that. This is a fun topic. As Daphne said, I'm Tom KraMer. I'm President and CEO of Kablooe Design. Kablooe Design is a forward industries company, and we do design and engineering and development of all sorts for medical devices, including surgical robotics. So this is a fun topic for me to talk about. And then I'm going to talk for the first 20 minutes or so on these design principles. And then FUTEK will come on and share some things as well, which I'm extremely excited about. FUTEK has been a great resource for Kablooe Design when we're working on medical devices, and has been a big help. So I'm excited to hear what their details are going to be today. So I'm going to talk a little bit more on the front end. I'm going to wax a little bit more philosophical, if that's okay. And I want to talk a little more theoretical, at least in the beginning, because everything that we do in life, no matter what it is, it all comes out of sort of our worldview of a subject. So whatever subject you're talking about, you've kind of got a world view or a world understanding of that subject, and out of that grows all the decisions you make. So when you think about the world of device development for medical devices and things like surgical robotics, it's very important to understand what your viewpoint and what your sort of worldview is around how an innovative solution is going to be developed and how you're going to come about that. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about those sorts of things, and then moving into some best practices surrounding that. So I'll jump right in. These are the three major points that I'm going to touch on today. I want to talk a little bit about how the brain works, because that has a lot to do with your worldview on designing and innovating. I want to talk a little bit about design thinking, especially as it relates to robotics, and then end with a few lessons learned. And so the FUTEK guys, will be a little bit more on the technical end, and I'll be a little bit more on the theoretical end. So it'll be a good blend. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, first. How the brain works. This is an interesting subject because the brain is a wonderful thing. It's very magic, but it's also very methodical. So when you think of those two things coming together, they almost seem like a contrast. And we all have heard about, left brain activities, right brain activities. We all get this, at least to a degree. But the methodical, is sort of the left brain. The magic is activities that happen on the right brain. And in order to be truly innovative and push the innovation and development model, you kind of have to have both. You have to have magic and method going on at the same time. So the question is, how do we do that? Because most of us haven't been trained that way, or we don't understand that. So there's been studies that have been out there, and a couple of them that I've found quite interesting. as they do brain, scan electrodes on people's brains to watch what part of the brain is lighting up during what activity and what's happening there. And some interesting things that they've discovered kind of go against conventional, traditional wisdom. One of them is that they've discovered that people don't tend to have a stronger left-sided or right-sided neural network in their brains. You might have been told as a kid, oh, you're good at math, you're a left brain person. Or you're an artist, you're a right brain person. But in reality, it's not, one side is not stronger than the other in your brain. It's all about the activities that you put in front of it and how you work your brain out, how you exercise it. They also discovered that personality types have nothing to do with one side being stronger. So when your mom told you, well, your personality is you're this math guy, so therefore you have a stronger left side to your brain, that's not true. Both sides are equally strong, equally active. It's all about the activities that you put in front of your brain. So I thought it was interesting when we think about how we develop from when we're kids, because our philosophy here at Kablooe is anybody can be a creative thinker. So you don't have to just hire these people over here and they're the creative group, and then these guys over here, they're the technical. That's not how we operate here at Kablooe, because we know that everybody can use both sides of their brain because they're connected by this thing called the corpus callosum in the middle. And it's a superhighway of signals going back and forth. So unless you've had a traumatic brain injury and that's been severed, you can use both sides of your brain. So anybody can be a creative, innovative thinker. Now, if you look at some studies that have been done, and you think about how we tick and how our brain works, Sir Ken Robinson talks in a TED Talk about a 24-year-long study that was done. And you don't see many studies that take place over 24 years. But this one's extremely interesting because what they did is they followed children from the time that they were kindergarten or pre-kindergarten up to the time they graduated college. And in the study, they saw that the research showed that young people lost their ability to think in what they called nonlinear ways, or they call it divergent thinking. And they understand that this divergent thinking, this nonlinear thinking, they understand that that is a key component to creativity. And creativity is going to be extremely important in engineering, as we see, because as an engineer, you're called to be a creative problem solver. That's your job as an engineer, to be a creative problem solver. So you have to think about the creative part of that sentence, not just the problem-solving part of it. I'll give you an example of something they did in that 24-year-long study. They took kindergartners and they asked them, draw a bird. And this is what one kindergartner drew under that instruction. Then they went through the week and learned math and subtraction, and you did workbooks like this where they subtract, things from a group. And then at the end of the week, they asked the kids the same question and said, or same command said, draw a bird. And this is what that same child drew for a bird at the end of the week. So you can see something going on the right side of the brain that interpreted what the essence of a bird was to them, very right side. But then when a lot of this linear thinking happened, they discovered truths about what they believed that a bird was and then reflected that in their creative output. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't learn math and subtraction, but the problem is they were being trained very linearly, very methodically on the left side. But artistic thinking is not linear. I like to call it scattered chaos thinking, but it's very similar to what they call divergent thinking or this nonlinear thinking. So I thought that was extremely interesting. And when we think a little bit about how we tick, I thought it'd be interesting to compare this to a hypothesis about what we can do about it, because at the age of 4, 98% of those kids were able to demonstrate divergent thinking. At the age of 9, only 32 could do it. At the age of 14, only 10%. And by the time they were done with their master's degree, only 2% of them could demonstrate that they could do divergent thinking when faced with a problem. So what do we do about this? Well, the Institute for Brain Potential has a lot of interesting training on this that I've taken a part of. And one thing we know is that a healthy brain can laugh and it can understand and appreciate art. But a diseased brain that has a problem with that corpus callosum, it doesn't do that. It doesn't laugh at art. It doesn't laugh at jokes. So the hypothesis might be, does environmental training mean the inverse of what we just saw from that disease? If someone environmentally doesn't give themselves enough laughter, enough art, would that cause an agenesis, a weakening of that corpus callosum? It's possible that this could be. So the part of the right side of your brain that's responsible for creative problem solving, that's also the same lobe of your brain that gets the joke when someone tells a joke for humor. That's the part that understands art. It's on the right side of your brain. That's the lobe that does creative problem solving. And again, as engineers, we're tasked to be creative problem solvers. So if we stimulate these parts of these things, jokes and artistic things, would creative problem solving, would that follow? Increased ability to do creative problem solving? I like to think that it does. And it's that lobe on the right side of the brain. So what do we do about this? Well, on the right side of the brain, there's a lot of things that you can do. So for instance, when people have phobias, they use humor to do what they call systematic desensitization to something that's bad, like their phobia. So if they were scared of spiders, they would use spider humor to desensitize them to that bad thing. So the question is, could we do the same thing for good things? Could we sensitize ourselves to some good, innovative, creative things if we did it? Well, if we expose ourselves to humor, we get a rise in what's called a brain-derived neurofactor in our brain. That rises in our brain. Your brain-derived neurofactor, it's a protein, and it's responsible for the neuroplasticity of your brain. The neuroplasticity is what is like your brain working out its muscle. You do stuff to it, you activate it, and it grows, and it gets neuroplastic. But it's also the part of your brain that is responsible for storing information. So if you realize that everything your brain does, out of all of it, 95% is habit, meaning it's stored information. It's very important to have good neuroplasticity and good active BDNF. So when you laugh at something humorous, you get that rise. And then you enjoy it because laughter makes you enjoy it, and you get a release of dopamine. And that release of dopamine makes you recognize it and want to do it again. So then you repeat it. So when it comes to creative problem solving, this all ties in. If we were to increase humor in our lives, you know, would it, and then we repeat artistic activities and be involved in artistic activities, we would become more creative people and better left-brained problem solvers. This is extremely apparent when we think about humor, and comics are a great way to think about it because comics are a blend of art and humor. And so I love comic books. Pablo Picasso once said that every child is born an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once you grow up. And that's what we saw from that study. So why is this relevant to us as innovators and designers and engineers in surgical robotics? Well, for one thing, we have our training, and then we're tasked to do problem solving, okay? Our training and our problem solving are kind of two different things. They're not as connected as people often think they are. For instance, your training is what gets you to the place that you need to be. So most of our training academically is very linear. We're taught about series of events, cause and effect, something that leads to something. All of these thoughts are linked, and that's all activities on the left side of your brain. This is why if you exercise the left side of your brain your whole academic career, you only have a 2% ability to do divergent thinking and solve problems creatively. However, experience, as we experience and we throw ourselves into these situations, that's where the problem solving comes in. And don't forget the word creative with problem solving. We have to be creative problem solvers. So the problem solving is where the divergent thinking comes in. That's where the creative part of the problem solving comes in, and that's on the right side of your brain. So this is where we do brainstorming. We start asking what ifs, and we start having these random associations that we wouldn't have otherwise thought of to solve the problems in our medical devices and in our technology. And this all happens on the right side of the brain. So it's extremely important to exercise the right side of the brain. Now, I want to just illustrate for you how this happens because this really illustrates it well and hits home. Think about the anatomy of a joke. Okay, when someone tells a joke is a series of linear statements that all build on each other and make sense one next to the other. And then there's a punchline, and the punchline doesn't make sense. It's a non sequitur, and it doesn't follow that linear series of events. And then because it doesn't follow that, it's a break in the linear, and it's humorous. Okay, when they scan people's brains while they're listening to a joke, and someone's telling the linear series of events that build up to the punchline, they see left side, left side, left side light up. Then they tell the punchline, which doesn't correspond to that linear progression. And there is a pause in the brain where nothing happens for a millisecond. And then that lobe on the right side lights up, and the person laughs and gets the punchline. Now think about creative problem solving for a second. When you laugh at a joke, you are actively participating in creative problem solving because you're taking something that doesn't fit the punchline and you're merging it and connecting it to something that it doesn't fit with, the linear progression of events. And in order to make it fit, you got to do some funny thinking and then put it together and then get it to fit, and then that's funny. So this is why humor is so closely related to creative problem solving. It not only exercises that part of the brain, but it's actually forcing you to participate in creative problem solving. So creative problem solving is very important in device design. And we have to think strongly about that. Okay, so next, I want to just talk a little bit about design thinking for robotics here and just hit some things that are important. So when it comes to design thinking, we like to look at things in terms of the 8 universal job steps. Okay, 8 universal job steps is a way of thinking about things. So every object that exists, like my coffee mug, this exists for a reason. This is a device and exists for a reason. And the reason it exists is to perform a job for a user. Okay, surgical robotics, same exact way. Whether I'm using a pencil or using my coffee mug or using a surgical robotic, I, as the user, will go through these 8 universal job steps every time I use it, no matter what it is. So when we're taking a look at our worldview of how we do design and development for medical technologies, we like to think of these 8 universal job steps and use those to help us be successful in our innovative development. Henry Ford's famous statement was, if I would have just listened to what my customers would have said, I would have just made a faster horse. So we don't want to go around just thinking, customers say the device has to do this, they need this better thing. That's good, and we need to pay attention to that. But you don't innovate in a strong way that way. You just end up making faster horses. For our customers, they can't tell us what we should make, but what they can do is they can tell us how they feel about the situation that they're in. Then it's our job to do that divergent thinking, that creative problem solving, and take what they feel and interpret that into what would solve the problems for their feelings that would then be innovative. That's the creative, chaos, divergent thinking that we have to go through, okay? So the 8 universal job steps are this. They're define, locate, prepare, confirm, execute, monitor, modify, conclude. So if I'm using my pencil, I have to first define that I need a pencil. Second, I have to locate it. I got to go find it. Third, I got to prepare, make sure that the lead isn't broken. Fourth, I have to confirm and scratch on the paper, make sure the lead's actually writing and maybe the de-eraser is actually working. I know nobody uses pencils anymore, but 5, I have to execute it. I have to actually use the pencil and write the thing that I need to write. That's the part that most everybody pays attention to when they're thinking about creative problem solving. But you have to pay attention to all of these things. Then I have to monitor. Do I need to erase something? Is my eraser gone? Then I have to modify. I got to go get an eraser that I stick on the end of it so I can erase. And then I have to finish what I'm doing and conclude and go put the pencil away. Okay? So if we know that everyone's going to go through these steps every time they use a device, why wouldn't we plan our design to satisfy everything that needs to happen for the user in every one of these steps? We would. And in order to do that, we got to figure out from the get-go what the users need in every one of those steps to be successful in that particular step. So what we do is we go out and we watch and we observe and we dig in and we ask questions and we do ethnographies and we do these deep dives digging into the user's world. And we don't just look at that device and that function. We look at all of these things because all of these things are important. The broad jobs out there that the user's doing, the users themselves, the near job, the device, the environment, all of these things we have to take into account and record what's going on, what's working for the user, what isn't working for the user, what's hard. And those things become our user interface requirements for the surgical robot. Okay, that's extremely important. So I gave you a quick crash course in how we think about approaching surgical robotic design. Okay, it's a fantastic way to approach it. I just want to share some quick lessons learned because I'm just going to take another 2 minutes here, and then I'm going to turn it over to the folks at FUTEK. But so as we've been designing surgical robots over the years, some lessons learned. Well, for one, small things work great in 3D CAD, but not necessarily in real life. So when you're doing something like a tiny little end effector for a surgical robotic that's going to enter a small space in the human tissue, you have to do this sort of real world comparison. Now, I'm not just talking about like forces, because we can design something in CAD and it could be this tiny, tiny end effector, and we have to grip something. We have to squeeze something with a certain amount of force. Well, we can build it in CAD so we know that it exerts that force. But in CAD, it might look like everything's rotating just fine, and we really have to pay attention to is it so small that the teeth on that, aren't going to hold for very long, or that the rotation is going to, it's going to put a lot of force on the pin that it's rotating on, and is that going to bind, those little things we really have to pay attention to, and we really have to, the way to get around that is to start prototyping as early as we can and testing things, but also making sure that, we're approaching these things in a realistic way. Ideas are great, but then you got to bring them down to reality. The second thing there was that durability is hard to design compared to fingers holding a scalpel. So what I mean by that is, if the standard right now is the physician's holding a scalpel in their fingers, they can do a lot of things. Their fingers are cushiony, they can feel how hard they're pressing, they can rotate that scalpel, there's a lot they can do. And they can be very durable holding that. Now, if we have some sort of tiny thing on the end effector of our surgical robot that is going to do that cutting, all of the durability that has to be transferred from the edge of the blade to the edge of the parts that are holding it, to the edges, to the parts that are causing it to have its rotation and its movement, and all the chain of events and all of the tolerances that have to happen along the way, it can be hard to make that durable. So you have to be realistic about the durability that you're going to pull off with the size and shapes of your parts. And designing parts to be very small and durable is a little bit different design than large parts and durable, because all of the radiuses and the fillets and the edges and where we know that the forces are going to travel, they all have to be built into a small part, which is different than a big part. Some of these things are obvious to us engineers, but the third thing is more theoretical, but we got to figure out how to enable the user to feel empowered. It's very important with surgeons. That's my 20 minutes there. But just to finish up, it's very important for surgeons to be empowered to do their job and to do their job better. And we certainly don't want, through the use of robotics, to feel like their empowerment to make quick decisions, to change their mind, to decide to go harder, to go softer, to take a different approach, that we're not taking those abilities away from them, that in fact we're enhancing those abilities. So that might seem obvious to somebody who sees a surgical robot at the end, because it does that, but it's not as obvious in the beginning when you're thinking about how you're going to design it. And you got to think about that in the beginning and always keep that in the front of your mind, because surgeon autonomy is so important when fleshing out the design. The surgeon might want to take different angles and better angles than they used to take by hand. And we want to empower them to be able to do that, take different angles of approach. We got to think about, if we allow them to do things differently than they do now, is it going to be too hard for them to adopt that new way of doing it? So we got to slide into their ability to adopt this new paradigm. And then imaging is a big thing too for empowerment. If we're going to have imaging, we got to make sure that imaging greatly augments their approach over what they're doing now, and that the imaging delivers intelligence for them. And it's not just passive imaging. And then a couple other things. We always want to be able to collect data, and we want to understand what data we can collect, how we should collect it, who's going to use it. Extremely important in the beginning, because if at the end we decide we want to collect data, putting sensors in afterwards is very tough. So we want to understand how we can do that at the beginning. And a lot of times we get our inspiration from looking at robots in adjacent industries. For instance, warehouse robotics, great things you can learn from warehouse robots that we might be able to pull in. But I guess the number one rule to understand about design thinking for surgical robotics is understand the problem that has to be solved. This means understanding the user and their needs, which is what I spent a lot of time talking about. And then by all means, make sure that it's manufacturable and durable and can function, but can also be manufactured and assembled. So all of these things are the soup that we bring to the table and think about right at the beginning as we start going through surgical robot. So review, use both sides of your brain. Think about the steps that the user has to go through to be successful, and never forget about robustness and empowerment of the user. If you do those things, you'll be on a really good path to creative innovation for your surgical robot project. All right, thank you guys very much. Glad we could run through that. I know it was a lot of information fast, but let's have our folks from FUTEK jump in and talk about some of the technical items.
Great. Thank you, Tom, very much. I appreciate that. And For our audience members, if you have any questions for Tom, please do enter them in our Q&A chat box, and we'll get to them right after we hear from our next speaker. And I'd like to welcome Ehsan Mokhberi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you, Tom. It was a great presentation so far. And continuing on that conversation about creativity and innovation, we know Kablooe as a design house, and we are actually collaborating on an existing project as of this moment. And it's really important to, as part of that holistic design, we come in as the sensing solution to this ecosystem. And as Tom explained, you know, that creativity and innovation are focused from the beginning being on that innovation side. So basically, we didn't invent the load cell, we didn't invent the force measurement or this technology, but basically, we try to innovate that and take it to the next level. Just a really quick overview of our company. We are a private company incorporated in Southern California since 1988. At the bottom right corner side, you see all the accreditations we have. So medtech market is a big part of our business, and surgical robotics, we've been engaged almost with all major surgical robotic programs since 2007-8, and we somehow collaborating with each one of them in a different manner, which each is IP of that company. But technically, our technology is piezo-resistive technology, metal foil bonded strain gauge, and our solution is sensing the strain measurement and translating that with high resolution electronics into force, torque, pressure, measurements, or indirectly to other measurements. And the most recognized project we ever done is having 2 sensors on board of the Mars Curiosity rover back in 2012, which is still after NASA sent the Perseverance up there. Curiosity is still operating, and that robot got a lot of publicity for NASA itself because of the way it was landed, and it was duplicated by Perseverance just last year. And so Mars Curiosity rover being a type of robot itself, as Tom mentioned, in other industries and other markets, but what we learned from those industries and brought it to medical market. So we almost supported every industry out there. And what we learned from aerospace application, imagine you're sending a product to another planet that requires to survive harsh environments. Those harsh environments such as vacuum, cryogenic, and you have to survive radiation, acoustics of the launch, and the vibration of the launch. And then you land there, and there's failure not an option. You know, you have to operate for the lifetime of that product. So we take the same mentality and we bring it back to the medtech market, and all of the things we learned, how to deal with temperature, how to deal with linearity of our type of solutions, learned from different industries and brought to this part of the market. So basically, right over here, we started from a 1-bedroom apartment. The founder CEO himself, being a sensor designer back in 1988, he collaborated on NASA Discovery Program after the unfortunate event of Challenger explosion. Basically, Rockwell International was awarded for Discovery Space Shuttle, and he was the sensor guru and the test engineer on that program. And after that program concluded, we started the sensor company here in Southern California. So as I mentioned, we didn't invent it, but basically we tried to focus on miniaturization and come up with really unique geometries. Our mentality from the beginning always been focused on that blue ocean strategy, basically not competing with other players in the market, but identifying the unmet need of the market and trying to fill the gaps in the market. Big part of it was achieved by having a high flexibility and the time to market, then having a really reliable solution, repeatable, reliable, linear, and most importantly, making sure that we serve the customer as a turnkey solution. So we focused not only on the mechanical side, we brought high-resolution electronics to the game, and then having an in-situ calibration, trying to provide modulated solutions to our market, so that way the sensing module would become one piece. So this is a module where we talked about. Basically, we have a sensor right at the shoulder and right at the drilling point, providing the feedback, making this robot autonomous. And most importantly is, basically, we try to point out that we bring the sense of touch to the machine or the robot. And that's one of the 5 senses every human has. And how does that relate to medical markets? When it comes to surgical robotics, is basically that haptic feedback and bringing that sense of touch to the fingertips of the surgeon. So with all kind of minimally invasive surgery, trying to have bringing that direct measurement from the tip of the tool to the console handles for the surgeon. So making sure you're not over pressuring a tissue or an organ, or you're not under pressuring and not applying the right force when you're cutting, stapling, or sealing an organ or tissue. And that's where we put our focus. But over years, we had to overcome many challenges. Most importantly, being able to have autoclavable and sterilizable solutions, which goes through harsh environments, and making sure these sensors become reusable, so that way the cost of procedures are lowered, and so this industry can afford to utilize the technology. On this really brief, talking about the fundamentals of our technology, so this is what I mentioned earlier. Basically, our sensors are a really stiff piece of a spring, and there is a deflective and exaggerated version, but this animation just shows that you try to detect deflection at a micron level. So, and then the sensing elements complete a Wheatstone bridge on the structure, and then we try to sense and pick up the changes of resistance and correlate them, translate them, amplify them to digital or analog output to take measurement out of them. Now, when it comes to surgical robotic market, in one picture, we try to show where we apply in this industry. So basically, we covered 3 fronts. From first front would be the capital equipment, anything that goes on the robot or the capital equipment assets, or any other type of medical devices. So this sense of touch, or this force or torque measurement, provides data for engineer. So now it's up to the company how to utilize that data. It could be used to close a loop. So for example, right at point number 1, we can have low-profile custom torque sensors made with, most of the times, harmonic gear heads or different type of torque motors inside of these joints, and provide a closed-loop feedback. So imagine, traditionally, current loops encoders are used to program for better precision motion control, but nowadays with the low-profile torque sensors inside, you can bring that precision motion control to the robot. Another front is same sensor can generate data. So as the high number of procedures taking place, that data collection over millions of procedures helps to understand and find trends and improve this design over years. And then lastly, we can log the data, depending on the type of electronics, to compare results and making better measurements. So right over here at the back end is the first front, the capital equipment. Then the second front is having sensors on board of the surgical instrument, which would be the instruments that would engage with the capital equipment. And usually in each one of these instruments, the function of this end effector is either to cut, staple, seal. There's a high variety of surgical tools, but majority of them, there is either a wire, a tube, a probe, some sort of this type of mechanism to manipulate the end effectors on that instrument. And in order to do that, there are usually brushless DC motors either on the capital equipment side or on the instrument itself, and then having a miniature torque sensor engage with that brushless DC motors, assist the design engineer to close loop and have a precision close loop feedback, and which directly translates into dexterity of the design. And lastly, the third part is at the fingertips, or basically end effectors. So right over here is the next generation of products that we have designed. So what you see on the screen, it's a 4 millimeter by 5 millimeter tension and compression load cell for force measurement. The sensor has one M1 thread on top and bottom. It is basically designed for high volume manufacturing, so it's cost effective. And it also has a design for a high variety of interconnectivity design. So in this case, you see a radial cable exit, and it could be conductors, it could be pin headers, connectors, or axial cable exit. And the sensor could be sealed to different levels, for low number of autoclave cycles, it could be sealed for 10, 20 sterilizing sessions. Or when it comes to a higher number of cycles, we have done glass in middle hermetic seal that sensor would go through hundreds of autoclave cycles. So the beauty of this product is it brings that sense of force measurement to the fingertips. Because of its size, it could be much closer to the tool and to the organ and go inside the abdominal cavity and taking more direct measurement. And doing that, it basically prevents all the losses when there is a mechanism that has too many components by taking direct measurement. The design has a through hole, so in this case, we can engage with the threads, but there are different means to connect to the sensor. It could be installed right on a wire, or it could be installed right on different type of probes and tubes, and we can come up with different welding mechanism or threading mechanism to connect them together. On right over here is actually, we took the pencil that Tom was talking about for that creativity, and we tried to actually compare our sensor to that pencil. And then you see on the right side, so the tip of that pencil is only 1 millimeter. So we tried to show that how tiny that solution is, 4 millimeter by 5 millimeter. And on the left side is the electronic interface. It is a high resolution SPI output. That board is 8 millimeter by 8 millimeter, which makes it really appealing to be embedded right next to the sensor. So that's the most important part, that we're not just a sensor company, we're an electrical company to help with interconnectivity as well, to provide that modulated solution. And on next device, this is what you see on the screen is basically an industrial robot, but the same concept and principle applies to the surgical robot. And on the very top, you see a traditional low-profile, lightweight flange-to-flange torque sensor that is usually mated to a harmonic drive. And what it does, it creates that closed-loop feedback that could go on every joint of the robot. As we get closer to the base of a robot, the moments are much higher, so they get up to 400, 500 Newton meter. And as we get closer to the wrist of the robot, they get in sub-Newton meters. So there is a high variety of flexibility to customize these solutions, along with electronic, to have all of them side by side and have them embedded as an OEM solution. Now, this is the other solution, QTA 141, and this is the one complementary to the previous slide. So what you see on the screen, it's a 10 millimeter height, 22 millimeter OD, which is designed for brushless DC motors such as Maxon or different similar brands in the market. So it's a reaction torque sensor with a through hole. So it would be sandwiched between the gear head and the next piece in the mechanism. Here we're showing it with a transparent flange. So you can imagine that the shaft of the motor would go through the through hole, and then as the sensor sandwiched in between, can see that torsion, and it can provide that closed loop feedback. So that miniaturization is what I'm trying to point out again compared to this golf ball. Right on the next slide, we have a similar concept, but in this case, instead of just torque measurement, we have actually two measurements. We have the torque and thrust. So we can measure the FZ on the force side, and we can measure the torque off of that axis. So what is useful for, it usually goes on a surgical drill for anything that as you're trying to drill into a bone tissue or you're trying to move and operate the torque. So this gives the both feedbacks, torque and thrust feedback together, so it can take a better measurement. It could be used for R&D purposes only, or it could be utilized to be embedded into the product. So as you see here, the product, it has a ribbon cable actually coming out, but it could be connectorized, or it could have different type of configuration on connectivity. And next one right here is a traditional rotary torque sensor shown here, which is basically same concept of torque measurement, but with having a higher RPM. So this type of solution could go up to several thousand RPM, and it's quite bulky to go inside the robotic arm. So what we did, we miniaturized the same concept. This solution can rotate up to 300 RPM. It has different capacities and different sizes, but the beauty of it is the face of the sensor is only 17 millimeter by 17 millimeter, and this shaft can take up to 2 Newton meter of torque measurement and up to 300 RPM. So this type of solution, for the R&D purposes, for assembly purposes, it can go directly in between the rotational mechanism as you're driving the next pieces into the robotic arm, and bring that sense of precision control to the hands of the engineer. And then right over here is a 6-degree freedom force and torque sensor. So there are plenty of options in the market, but this robotic market started getting commercialized back in 80s and 90s by automotive industry. Companies like KUKA, they put a lot of heavy investments to automate that industry. And then later, in the past 20 years, as surgical robot tried to expand this market, a lot of engineers and a lot of people came from that market. So they inherited a lot of the know-how from that market. But we tried to do something similar to Tesla. Instead of just going to Detroit, having a car company copy what has been done for 100 years, we tried to actually come and learn what is not covered or what is the value to the surgical robot, and create a unique 6-degree freedom solution for FUTEK and for the surgical market. So what's unique about FUTEK is being lightweight, so because that translates, because the sensor directly goes on the robot at the wrist or at the base, and then the height and the weight of the sensor matters the most. Second, most of the traditional 6-degree freedom solutions, they have a bulky industrial interface, which they are embedded in another box or at a distance, so all of that become a problem. So we designed a really miniature embedded solution. It's an SPI 6-channel that goes right inside the sensor. So the sensor and its electronics, it becomes an independent module that could be swapped and troubleshooted if needed. And then the solution could be designed for a specific stiffness, because the stiffness is a really hot topic for a design engineer on a surgical arm. And then on top of that, overload protection and data matrix compensation. So overload protection, a traditional strain gauge type sensor has 150% of its range as a safe overload. When it comes to this type of solutions, our customers require to have 2 to 4x safe overload. So in this solution on the left side, because it's low capacity, we had up to 4 times the capacity overload protection. And then being a 6-degree freedom solution, crosstalk is a big challenge, and as you're loading one axis, and what is the effect on that on the other axis. We have both coupled and decoupled solution, and when it comes to coupled solutions, we try to use data matrix and electronics and compensate for that by just calibrating it here at FUTEK and take all those measurements and how they impact the other axis of measurement and build it into the electronics of the sensor. And going to the next product I want to show you, as we're getting to the end of this webinar, I just want to show you one more product here. Okay, can we have a next slide here? I have a hard time pushing it. Daphne, can you help us with moving to the next slide?
Sure. Is it this one here? Or
we should go to 47 right now.
Okay, 47. Okay, we should see 47 on screen.
Okay. It might be shown on your screen, but I will. So you should see an L-shaped solution. So this L-shaped solution is basically a 3-degree freedom solution that can measure the X, Y, and Z forces. So usually it's designed with its embedded electronics to go on a gimbal or going right on a console of a surgical tool, where it can measure and monitor all the motions of the surgeon as they are manipulating the gimbal to manipulate the tool inside the abdominal cavity. So this type of solution, as you see the picture of it, it looks really OEM, bare bone OEM, and it's really customizable, and it's specifically designed for a unique geometry to go inside that device. If we can go to next slide.
Okay, we have 48 on screen.
On slide 48, we just try to conclude that the high-resolution electronics, we had a focus when designing solutions for medical market. We designed for class 3 type electronics. That means highest quality of semiconductor, highest quality of PCB board, and fabrication process. And then the design is for high resolution, low power and consumption, and also being able to have fault detection mechanism inside. So that fault detection mechanism, so the SPI solution would directly talk to the microcontroller on the capital equipment side, and with having features for fault detection, and the device can have a constant health check on the sensor. This is really important to have this closed loop feedback built into the system. As every product that is a matter of life and death, basically anything that is FDA or FAA approved, this type of solution is quite appealing. And then that's where our electronic team teamed up with the mechanical, making sure the design are spec for medtech market. And then going to last slide is basically slide 49. We just tried to show, this is just a conceptual picture of the QLA414 I mentioned earlier, showing that how that miniature 4x5 millimeter sensor could be as close as possible to the end effector of the tool, taking direct measurement to prevent any losses for the friction or other components in the system. And that direct measurement helps for improving design, with achieving the ultimate goal, having a precision motion control and highest dexterity. And thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tom and Daphne. And then I think I'll pass to Daphne at this point, and if you want to take some questions.
Thank you, Ehsan, very much. I appreciate that. And thanks, Tom, for your presentation earlier. So to our audience, we're going to get started on our Q&A. And as a reminder, you may submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon. And it should be at the side of your screen. If not, just click on Q&A. And then type your question into the text box. And if we don't get to your question today, our speakers will follow up afterward with you. So we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So I just wanted to start, by asking, it seems like miniaturization is an ongoing trend. And now, is this just for tools that enter the human body, or is this also for the equipment themselves?
So what you have seen in the, please go ahead, Tom, and I will add to that maybe again.
Oh, sure. And I think you guys will be able to comment on this just as much as I will. But very good question. Obviously for devices that are entering the body, there's obvious reasons why miniaturization is important. For equipment, outside of the body, you again have to, it kind of goes back to that, your worldview of design thinking. You know, oftentimes people will say, well, I need this controller or this console or this generator. You know, it has to be small and lightweight. And, you know, and we always ask why. We always have to come back to that and say, well, why does it have to be small? There's times when smaller isn't always better for external equipment. There's certain controllers that, you know, you want to make to match the dexterity of the hand size. And if there's finesse controls that have to be done, it can't be so tiny that somebody that's wearing double gloved hands can't, you know, access those fine controls with their motor skills. So I think the answer is no, it isn't always smaller and tinier and more lightweight for devices and objects outside of the body and the equipment. It has to be right for the job that it has to do. You remember those job steps. It has to be right for the job, right for the user interface, and that's going to dictate whether or not it needs to be, you know, miniature or not.
Thanks. Ehsan, do you have anything to add to that?
On our side, what we have seen in the market, basically, in the past 10 years, the surgical robotics market started with some really specific procedures at the beginning. But after getting into the second decade of this market, now there are a lot of startups surfacing, and some of them are trying to, the bigger organizations trying to actually create more flexible, configurable solutions to cover a wide range of solutions. So you have seen some of the major players just focus on, for example, the torso and the abdominal procedures, trying to expand on that front. So they're trying to create that ecosystem and that platform that could be configurable. And the smaller startups getting into the market, they're trying to be more specific and be specialists on a specific procedure. So as designing tools for both ends of the market, the miniaturization we refer to, miniature is not just by size, it's relevant to the load as well. Sometimes we are talking about a 1,000-pound sensor or a torque sensor, but when it comes to design a miniature lightweight solution as compared to that size of a motor, we have a focus to do that. So to conclude, basically, part of the market is focusing on creating more horizontal solutions to cover all bases, and some trying to go more vertical. And then in order to do that, space becoming an issue, and then flexibility and being configurable, definitely it's something they have in mind. And we have seen companies looking for lighter weight and smaller type of tools as we go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I was wondering if either of you see any current unmet needs in the surgical robotics marketplace.
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a pretty broad one too. You know, the answer is yes. There's unmet needs everywhere, and some of those unmet needs are big and broad. Like, for instance, you know, brain tumors. You know, there's a lot more that can be done with surgical robotics in that area. And then other things are very, very specific, like, you know, surgical robotics for, let's say, you know, a pelvic suturing, you know. Well, for that, there's a whole bunch of unmet needs that have to occur just for that one particular procedure. And they're all things about, you know, making sure that the robot can get in there and make sure that, you know, the anchors, you know, are stuck in with the right amount of force that they're going to hold. And that, you know, so tough for me to answer that directly, but I would say, yes, there's a lot of unmet needs. And as time goes on, some of the technologies that FUTEK has are things that we see that always enable us to start meeting those needs. So the next project that we're on, we're looking at some of these new devices, these new sensors, and being able to solve some of those needs.
Excellent.
On our side, what we have seen in the market 20 years ago, imagine the market was new. So basically, they would consult the existing surgeons in the market. They have to design for the baby boomers of the market. And now today, and 20 years later, we are seeing companies are designing for the latest XY generations of the market. Having said that, we are seeing the technology is shifting, and mostly the interface with these surgical tools are changing. So, the newer generation being more of a gamer generation. So as far as using headsets, virtual reality, and trying to capitalize on joysticks that they use in their game console for years and bringing back to the surgical robot, they're trying to fill that gap by cut the learning curve. Because the traditional surgeon from the baby boomer generation was a hands-on surgeon that always wanted to touch everything. So the focus was how to create solutions so they have the best sense of the haptic in their hand. And when it comes in the past 2-3 years, I'm noticing that more and more companies are focusing to put that virtual reality into the game. And with doing that, bringing high-resolution visual solution to the game being one game changer. And on top of that, bringing other type of sensing solutions to collect data as much as possible and make better decisions being the other side of it. So that shift actually goes by these generations, and I think that's what we're seeing in the next couple of years.
Thank you. Are you seeing requirements in medical device robotics that seek development of a proprietary component solution in low volumes that would be developed by FUTEK with NRE fees and are only sold to one customer?
It is definitely possible. So usually when it comes to this type of solution, the capital equipment or the concept already exists. And then it's a retrofit process. It's a Z to A process. We have to come in and see what is the size constraint, what are the space we have, what are the requirements. Usually we try to communicate with our customers, getting their wish list in order and put them into an order of importance to see as far as the size and requirements, what matters the most to them. And when it comes to, so basically we take our know-how from the last 30 years and we try to first bring the standard solutions from catalog to the table. But if there's a unique application that a customer has something that such a solution never been developed, because the principles are the same, it's just how to innovate it with a unique geometry and design for manufacturability to be cost effective. So good portion of our business, I would say more than 30% of our business is basically not advertised on a website, is because its IP is tied to a specific customer, and that collaboration took place, and we contracted and we created a solution that is unique to that customer and been designed for them.
Thank you. What do each of you think about remote surgical robots?
That's a good question. Remote surgical robotics, it has its place, but it's not for every situation. And I would say, like, if you think about situations where, remember we talked about enabling the surgeon to feel like they're getting more control. We're really helping them have more control. Sometimes being remote works against that. And that's why Ehsan mentioned virtual reality and augmented reality. You see a lot of these headsets that surgeons are wearing where, it's laying out information visually in front of them, over the patient as they're working on it. That's very empowering because it's letting the surgeon do their job with more knowledge and more information than they would otherwise do it. Well, it's the same thing with like remote. If you're not remote and you're right there, but you're controlling a robot right there in the room with the patient, if something goes wrong, something happens, and you have to stop, you got to rush over to that patient and abort, or change courses. You're right there to do that. So remote is really good when that's not an issue, and you really want to streamline the activities, and then it's fantastic. So it just has to be used in the right scenario.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think that's all the time we have today, and I definitely want to thank Tom and Ehsan so much for your presentations today. Very insightful and informative. And thanks to our audience very much for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, our speakers will follow up afterward. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available today to listen to the broadcast. I want to thank our sponsor, FUTEK, as well as everyone on the call with us today. We appreciate your attention and your participation. This webinar is copyright 2021 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by and copyrighted by Informa Markets. The individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of our speakers, Tom and Ehsan, thank you very much for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.